You are at the Tourism Ambassadors Tourism Academy. Welcome. Our Academy channel will always remain free of charge. During this process, we ask our curious, learning enthusiast listeners to guide us by subscribing to the channel, asking questions, and requesting new information. Everyone should be able to share their thoughts on a literary and ethical level with free and bold ideas. Our motto is, the priority is the courage to know the truth, followed by know yourself and then ask your questions freely. The narration of our content is produced entirely by artificial intelligence. As we move forward, we hope to hold a genuine discussion if volunteers and interested individuals willing to dedicate time to this project join the team. For the time being, due to time constraints, financial limitations, and our inability to invest in equipment, we are continuing the process in this manner. I apologize for this situation. As the Tourism Academy, I'm striving to maintain regular posts by dedicating an average of 40 hours a week to this work, believing that current shortcomings should not hinder our ability to share information. My request to you is to support us through your follows, likes, and comments. May your hearts be at peace and your minds remain open.
Thank you so much for having me back for another deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. So, to kick things off for you listening at home, I want you to imagine something. Just picture yourself sitting in a completely pitch black room.
Like zero visibility.
Right, zero. No windows, no furniture. You can't orient yourself at all. And then suddenly, a single tiny point of light just appears on the wall in front of you.
Oh, yeah.
So you watch it for a few seconds and it begins to move. It drifts a few inches to the left, maybe a little to the right. It seems undeniable, right?
Yeah, you'd swear it was moving.
But what if I told you that the light isn't moving at all? Like, the movement is entirely a biological illusion. It's just created by the microscopic jitters of your own eye.
The autokinetic effect?
Exactly. But here is the crazy part. What if I told you that a complete stranger sitting next to you in that dark room could effortlessly convince your brain to see that stationary light move exactly 5 inches just by saying so out loud?
It's terrifying when you really think about it.
It really is. So today we are unpacking a century of human behavior. We're looking at this massive, comprehensive chronology of social psychology. We want to deconstruct the very fabric of human nature and basically ask one huge question. Are we ever truly acting alone?
And, to ground us, we should probably look at Gordon Allport's classic 1954 definition. He said, social psychology is the scientific study of how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the real or imagined presence of others.
Yes, the imagined part is what always gets me.
Right. What's fascinating here is that single word, because it implies this profound vulnerability in our cognitive architecture. We don't even need a physical audience to alter our behavior.
Just thinking someone is judging us is enough.
Exactly. The mere psychological weight of, say, cultural expectations or just the internalized voice of a parent, that abstract concept is enough to fundamentally rewire how our brains process reality.
So we're basically tracking a lineage of scientific inquiry today, and it stretches all the way from 1898 to a modern replication crisis that honestly almost broke the scientific community.
It was a massive earthquake for the field.
Yeah. But let's wind the clock all the way back to the genesis of this entire field, late 19th century. Because before anyone was trying to explain massive political movements or things like that, researchers just had to ask a really painfully simple question.
Right, like, does just having another breathing human being in the room change how you do a basic task?
Exactly. And that brings us to Norman Triplett in 1898. Now, he wasn't looking at the dark depths of the human psyche or anything. He was just a guy looking at bicycle racing records.
He was analyzing the official velodrome records of the era, and he noticed this very distinct, mathematically significant discrepancy.
What did he find?
Well, when these highly trained cyclists were on the track alone, racing against the clock, which they call unpaced time trials, they rode at a certain respectable speed. But when those exact same cyclists were put on the track alongside other competitors, their times dropped dramatically. Yeah, they were consistently and measurably faster. And this wasn't just some minor fluctuation. It was a permanent shift in physiological output, driven entirely by the presence of other bodies.
It's the ultimate gym buddy effect. I mean, you go to the gym on a Tuesday morning by yourself and you lift a decent amount of weight, but the second your friend is standing there,
or even just an intimidating stranger on the next bench.
Right. You unconsciously push harder, you squeeze out 2 more reps just because someone with eyeballs is in your general vicinity.
Exactly. So Triplett wanted to prove this in a lab setting. But Obviously, you can't easily put velodromes inside a laboratory in 1898.
Right, logistics were a bit tricky.
So he used children and fishing reels.
Which is such a funny image to me.
It's a brilliantly simple substitution, really. He designed this mechanism attached to a fishing reel and told the kids to wind the reel as fast as they physically could, just to move a little flag across a set distance.
And he timed them, right.
Meticulously. First, the children performed the task in complete isolation. Then, they performed the exact same task alongside another child who was also winding a reel.
Did they know they were racing?
That's the thing. They weren't explicitly told it was a race. It was merely a co-acting environment.
But roughly half of those kids wound the reel significantly faster when the other child was there.
Yeah. It seems innocent, but it literally proved that human energy is contagious. Our physical limitations are dictated by our social environment.
Which is wild. But, the science needed a bit more formalization. And that arrived in 1920 with Floyd Allport.
Yes. He's the one who coined the term we still use today, social facilitation.
And he took Triplett's basic fishing reels and upgraded the whole methodology, didn't he?
He did. He had adult participants complete a battery of cognitive and physical tasks. Things like crossing out vowels on a page, doing complex multiplication, generating word associations.
That's exhausting.
Oh, totally. And he compared their solitary output to their output in a group setting. And his findings corroborated Triplett's. The quantity of work produced in a group was undeniably higher.
Okay, but let's pause and unpack this, because there's a major contradiction here in real life.
What do you mean?
Well, if I am typing an email by myself, I'm fine. But if my boss is standing directly behind my chair watching my screen, I suddenly forget how to spell my own name. I completely freeze up.
Oh, absolutely.
So we aren't always better when people are watching. Sometimes we just completely fall apart.
And that is the exact paradox that confounded the field for decades. Allport himself documented it in his data. While the overall quantity of work increased in groups, the quality often plummeted.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and for some specific tasks, people just completely shut down. We call this inverse effect social inhibition.
So for 45 years, psychologists are just arguing about why an audience makes you a superhero one day and incompetent the next.
Basically, yes. It wasn't until 1965 that Robert Zejonc introduced arousal theory to solve the puzzle.
I have to say, I find Zejonc's explanation so satisfying because it really bridges the gap between our psychology and our pure animal biology.
It truly does. Zejonc argued that the mere presence of other members of our species creates this automatic state of physiological arousal.
Like an instinct.
Exactly. Our heart rate subtly increases, our nervous system primes itself. Evolutionarily, this makes total sense. If another human is near you, you need to be alert. They might be a mate, a competitor, or a threat.
So your body just goes into standby mode.
Precisely. Now, Zejonc realized that this physical arousal acts as an amplifier. If you are performing a task that is incredibly easy, or one you've practiced so many times, it's automatic. Like a pro cyclist pedaling a bike, that burst of nervous arousal amplifies your focus and energy, you perform better.
And that is social facilitation.
Right.
But what if the task is novel or cognitively demanding? Like me trying to parallel park a borrowed car on a busy street with traffic waiting behind me.
Then that exact same physiological arousal becomes a massive liability. Your brain is already using all of its available cognitive load just to figure out the complex task.
Right.
So when you add the intense physical arousal of being watched, it overwhelms the system. The arousal translates into crippling anxiety, and your performance crashes. That is social inhibition.
The mechanism is identical human arouser from an audience, but the outcome depends entirely on how good you are at the task to begin with.
Such an elegant explanation of human inconsistency, isn't it?
It really is. But, this entire concept assumes that people are just working next to each other. What happens when we have to work together?
Ah, yes.
Because if we look at Max Ringelmann's research from 1913, his findings on group work paint a remarkably less flattering portrait of humanity.
Ringelmann was a French agricultural engineer, so his primary concern was labor efficiency on farms.
He wasn't even a psychologist.
No, not at all. He designed an experiment using a simple rope and a dynamometer, which is a tool that measures pulling force. He wanted to calculate exactly how much physical force a human could exert under different conditions.
Okay.
He started by having men pull on the rope individually, recorded their maximum force. Then he had them pull in pairs, then in groups of 3, and finally in groups of 8.
Which, the math here should be incredibly straightforward.
I think so.
If one person pulls with 100 units of force, 2 people should pull with 200 units and 8 people should pull with 800 units. It's just basic addition.
But human behavior rarely conforms to basic arithmetic. The data revealed a shocking inverse relationship between the size of the group and the amount of effort exerted by any single individual.
How bad was it?
When 2 men pulled together, they did not reach 200% of the individual average. They only exerted 93% of their combined potential.
So they already lost 7%.
Yes. With 3 men, it dropped to 85%. And when he analyzed the groups of 8 men, the total force generated was only equivalent to about 49% of what those men could achieve individually.
Wait, half of their potential efforts simply vanished.
Vanished into the ether. And this phenomenon became known as social loafing.
That is just the scientific validation of every group project I ever suffered through in high school.
Exactly. The larger the group, the more you assume someone else is going to step up and do the heavy lifting.
You can just put your hands on the rope, lean back, make a strained face, and know the other 7 guys will pick up the slack.
Right.
But I do have to play devil's advocate here, just thinking about the physical reality of a rope.
Go for it.
If you have 8 grown men trying to pull on one single rope, they're going to be bumping elbows, right? Stepping on each other's feet, pulling at slightly different angles.
Sure.
Couldn't this massive drop in force just be a coordination problem? Is it actually psychological laziness, or is it just physical clumsiness?
And that is the exact methodological critique that hung over Ringelmann's work for over half a century.
Really?
Oh, yeah. In 1974, researchers Alan Ingham and his colleagues formally challenged the findings. They argued you couldn't separate a loss of motivation from a mere loss of mechanical coordination.
So they needed a better test.
The field needed an experiment that entirely removed physical coordination from the equation. And that challenge was answered in 1979 by Bib Latané. And it's a masterclass in psychological design.
Latané's setup is brilliant. He didn't use ropes or physical pulling at all. He used sound.
He brought participants into a soundproof laboratory, and he equipped them with blindfolds and heavy industrial headphones.
Okay.
Through the headphones, he blasted a continuous deafening white noise. So the participants were completely deprived of their visual and auditory senses. They couldn't see anyone, and they couldn't hear their own voices, let alone anyone else's.
It sounds a bit like sensory torture.
It does. But then the experimenters instructed the participants to shout as loudly as they possibly could.
So where does the group dynamic come in?
The genius is in the variables. For some trials, the researchers tapped the participant on the shoulder and signaled, okay, in this round, you are shouting entirely alone in the room.
Got it.
In other trials, they signaled, okay, in this round, there are 5 other people in the room with you, and you are all going to shout at the exact same time.
But because of the blindfolds and the deafening noise.
Exactly. The participant had absolutely no way of verifying if anyone else was actually there. They removed coordination entirely. You cannot trip over someone else's voice when you're shouting into a sensory void.
The only variable changing was what the participant believed about their social environment.
Yes. And the results proved Ringelmann was right all along. Even without any physical interference, when participants simply believed they were part of a group, the decibel level of their shouting dropped significantly.
Wow. So when they thought they were alone, they screamed their lungs out.
And when they thought they were in a chorus, they held back. Undeniable proof of a motivational deficit. It demonstrated that as a group expands, the psychological pressure on any single individual to perform diffuses.
The burden is just spread too thin.
Right. The individual feels anonymous and therefore unaccountable. But we have to introduce a vital nuance here. A decade later, in 1989, a researcher named P. Christopher Early applied a cross-cultural framework to this.
Okay, what did he find?
He discovered that social loafing is not a universal human absolute.
Really?
Right.
So our cultural software dictates our laziness?
Essentially, yes. Early demonstrated that social loafing is highly prevalent in individualistic cultures.
Like the US or Western Europe?
Yes, places where societal values prioritize personal achievement and individual recognition. If an individualistic person doesn't feel their specific contribution will be recognized, they withdraw effort.
Makes sense.
Conversely, in collectivist cultures, early study participants in China and Israel, where a person's identity is deeply interwoven with the success and harmony of the group, social loafing occurred at drastically lower rates, sometimes not at all.
Wow.
The diffusion of responsibility doesn't occur in the same way when the group's failure is internalized as a personal failure.
That is a staggering realization. The way we perceive our own exhaustion, our own willingness to yell into a void, is programmed by the culture we happen to be born into.
He is truly fascinating.
But as we track this chronology forward, the world outside the laboratory was changing in some terrifying ways. We're moving out of the early 20th century and into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s.
A dark time globally.
The Great Depression ravages the global economy. Authoritarian regimes rise in Europe. World War II unleashes unimaginable destruction. The trivial questions of bicycle races and rope pulling suddenly seem woefully inadequate.
The scientific community pivoted hard.
They had to. They needed to ask, how do political structures alter human morality? How can millions of seemingly decent people be swept up in fascist ideologies?
And the historical context fundamentally demanded a new psychology. One of the primary architects of this era was Kurt Lewin.
Let's talk about Lewin.
He, along with Ronald Lippitt and Ralph White, conducted a pivotal study in 1939. They didn't want to study crowds. They wanted to study the focal point of the crowd, the leader.
Right.
They wanted to empirically test how different styles of authority shape the emotional and behavioral reality of the people underneath them.
And the methodology they chose to tackle this massive geopolitical question was, ironically, very small scale.
Very.
They didn't look at soldiers or politicians. They looked at 10-year-old boys in an after-school arts and crafts club making papier-mâché masks.
It seems quaint, but the design was strict. Lewin and his team structured the clubs to be identical in every way, except for the adult assigned to lead them. They meticulously trained these adults to exhibit one of three distinct leadership styles.
What were they?
First was the autocratic leader. This individual dictated every single step of the project, offered zero explanation for his rules, assigned partners arbitrarily, and remained aloof and commanding.
Basically a dictator.
Yes. Second was the democratic leader. This adult presented the overall goal, but encouraged the boys to figure out the steps together. He allowed them to choose their own partners and acted as a guiding member of the group rather than a boss.
And the third?
Third was the laissez-faire leader. This adult essentially abdicated all responsibility. He provided the materials, explicitly stated he would not participate, and only answered questions if directly asked. He let the boys do whatever they wanted.
And the behavioral fit-out from these three styles was immediate and extreme.
Oh, totally. Under the autocratic leader, the boys fractured. Some became highly aggressive, bullying the smaller kids. Others exhibited severe apathy, basically just shutting down and staring at the wall until told what to do.
That's so sad.
It was. But under the democratic leader, the environment was highly collaborative. The boys showed the greatest originality in their crafts. They helped one another, and they continued working, even when the leader briefly left the room.
And the laissez-faire group?
Pure chaos. They produced the lowest quality of work, spent most of their time goofing off, and actually demanded more structure from the adult.
So, on the surface, it feels like the perfect scientific endorsement of Western democracy, right when the West desperately needed an endorsement.
It did play out that way historically.
But looking at this critically today, I have to point out a massive methodological blind spot.
Let's hear it.
Okay, let's unpack this. They're drawing conclusions about global human governance using a sample size consisting exclusively of 10-year-old white middle-class American boys in 1939. Can we really generalize that behavior to adult populations navigating complex political systems globally?
Your skepticism is entirely warranted, and it reflects the exact core criticism modern researchers apply to this study. As Martin Chambers articulated in his year 2000 retrospective on leadership research, you just cannot seamlessly extrapolate the behavior of a homogeneous group of American children onto the diverse adult populations of the world.
It's just too huge of a leap.
Furthermore, there's a strong argument regarding experimenter bias. Lewin was a Jewish refugee who fled Nazi Germany in 1933. He had a profound personal investment in proving the superiority of democratic systems.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Critics argue the researchers may have subtly operationalized the definitions of the leadership styles to ensure the democratic group appeared the most psychologically healthy.
So the autocratic leader might have been instructed to be like a little extra mean just to ensure the data proved the point.
It is a strong possibility that compromises the pure objectivity of the findings.
Yeah.
However, despite these very real flaws, Lewin's ultimate contribution to the field transcended the specific results of that boys' club.
Oh, so?
He synthesized his observations into field theory, famously encapsulated by his equation, B, F, P, E. Behavior is a function of the person and their environment.
It looks so simple on a chalkboard. B equals F, parenthesis P, comma E.
But its implications shattered the existing paradigms of psychology. Prior to Lewin, a lot of behavioral analysis relied on innate traits. If someone committed a crime, it was because they possessed a quote-unquote criminal personality.
Right.
Lewin forced the scientific community to acknowledge that the environmental field, the systemic pressures, the leadership structures, the immediate social context exerts a force on the individual that is often way more powerful than their innate disposition. You cannot understand the behavior without understanding the psychological space in which it occurs.
Behavior is a function of the person and their environment. That concept is really the absolute bedrock for what comes next, because if the environment is strong enough, it can make us deny reality itself.
Which brings us to the giants of conformity research.
Exactly. Muzafer Sharif and Solomon Asch. Let's start with Sharif in the mid-1930s. He wanted to understand how a group of people with no prior connection can spontaneously generate a shared set of rules or beliefs out of thin air. How do norms form?
To test this, Sharif utilized the autokinetic effect, which is the visual illusion you described perfectly in our opening. In a completely darkened environment lacking any frame of reference, a stationary point of light will appear to wander.
So Sharif brought participants into this dark room individually and asked them to estimate how far the light moved, right?
Yes. And because it's an optical illusion, the human brain is just guessing. One person says the light moved 2 inches. Another person is absolutely convinced it moved 10 inches. The baseline answers are scattered all over the board.
But then Sharif introduces the social environment.
Exactly. He brings the participants back into the dark room, but this time in groups of 3. And he asks them to state their estimates out loud, one by one.
And this is where you see the gravitational pull of the group in real time. Over a series of trials, the person who saw 2 inches and the person who saw 10 inches start to unconsciously calibrate their answers.
They begin to compromise.
Eventually, the entire group converges on a single shared reality, say 6 inches. They have manufactured a norm. And the most chilling part, when Sharif brought those individuals back into the room entirely alone, weeks later, they didn't revert to their original individual estimate.
No, they didn't.
They stuck with the group's number. The group's hallucination had become their permanent personal truth.
This phenomenon is termed informational social influence. It occurs in situations of high ambiguity. When we lack objective data, when we feel uncertain about our own perceptions, we look to the people around us as a source of information.
We just assume the crowd knows better than we do.
We assume that the collective wisdom of the crowd is more accurate than our isolated individual judgment. It's a highly adaptive heuristic. But Sharif proved how easily it could be manipulated to construct false realities.
But then, roughly 15 years later, in 1951, Solomon Asch looks at Sharif's work and fundamentally disagrees with the premise.
He had a major issue with the methodology.
Asch says, look, Sharif put people in a pitch black room and asked them to measure an optical illusion. Of course they looked to others for help. They were totally lost. But human beings aren't cheap. Asch believed if the reality is completely unambiguous, if the truth is staring them right in the face in broad daylight, a person will trust their own eyes over a crowd.
Asch designed his experiment with the explicit intention of proving human independence. He wanted to show that rational individuals would reject group consensus if that consensus was demonstrably false.
And he ended up proving the exact opposite, creating arguably the most famous visual in all of psychology.
The line test.
Yes, let's walk through the Asch line experiment because the psychological tension of this setup is just incredible. Imagine you sign up for a vision test. You walk into a brightly lit classroom and sit down at a table with 7 other participants. You think they are regular people just like you, but they are all Confederates actors paid by the researcher. You happen to sit near the very end of the table.
Setting the trap.
The researcher stands at the front and holds up 2 large white cards. Card A has a single vertical line drawn on it. Card B has 3 vertical lines of noticeably different lengths, labeled 1, 2, and 3. Your job is incredibly simple. Look at card A and tell the researcher which line on card B is the exact same length.
And it is vital to emphasize just how easy this task was. The matching line was completely obvious. In control groups where individuals took this test alone, the error rate was less than 1%.
So the test begins. The researcher asks the first person at the table for their answer. They confidently say line 2. The next person says line 2. It goes down the line. Everyone agrees, and you agree because line 2 is clearly the right answer.
Easy.
This happens for a couple of rounds. Everyone is relaxed. But then on the 3rd trial, the researcher holds up a new set of cards. The match is clearly line 3. But the first actor looks at it and says, line 1.
And you think, did he just misspeak?
Right. But then the second actor nods and says line 1. The third, fourth, and fifth actors all say line 1. It gets to you. You are staring at the cards. Your eyes are screaming that the answer is line 3.
But 5 rational-looking human beings have just confidently stated that reality is something else entirely.
What goes through a person's mind in that moment?
The cognitive dissonance experienced by the participant is profound. Their physiological arousal spikes. They are suddenly forced to choose between the evidence of their own senses and the immense invisible pressure of group cohesion.
And Asch was horrified by the results. 76% of the real participants conformed to the blatantly wrong answer at least once during the experiment.
76%.
Overall, on the critical trials where the group gave the wrong answer, participants conformed about 1/3 of the time. They literally verbally denied objective reality just to blend in with a room full of strangers.
What Asch uncovered was fundamentally different from Sharif's informational influence. The participants in Asch's study weren't confused. During the debriefings, the vast majority admitted they knew the group was completely wrong.
So why did they do it?
They conformed anyway, due to normative social influence. This is the drive to conform, not to be correct, but to be accepted. It is the fear of being perceived as deviant, difficult, or socially awkward. The fear of social ostracization is so deeply rooted in our evolutionary biology that it can effortlessly override our commitment to empirical truth.
I think about this every time I'm in a meeting at work and someone pitches a terrible idea. But 3 people nod and suddenly everyone is nodding, and I just find myself nodding too because I don't want to be the one guy who ruins the vibe.
It is a pervasive mechanism. However, we must provide context. Replications of Asch's study over the decades have shown that conformity rates are not a fixed constant of human nature.
What do the replications say?
Bond and Smith's exhaustive 1996 meta-analysis revealed that conformity is highly sensitive to cultural environments. Unsurprisingly, in collectivist cultures, conformity rates on the Asch task were significantly higher as maintaining group harmony is prioritized over individual expression.
That tracks with what we heard earlier about social loafing.
Exactly. Furthermore, even within the United States, conformity rates have fluctuated since the 1950s. This suggests that Asch's initial high rates may have been partially reflective of the deeply conformist McCarthy-era culture of America at the time.
That historical context is crucial. And speaking of the psychological aftermath of the mid-20th century, we have to address one of the most culturally massive and heavily debated studies from this era. We're turning to Theodor Adorno and his colleagues in 1950 and their monumental research on the authoritarian personality.
This is a heavy topic.
It is. Now, before we delve into the details of this, I need to make something explicitly clear to you listening. Our sources mandate, and we completely agree, that we must apply our strict impartiality rule here. The concepts we are about to discuss deal with politically charged historical attempts to categorize human belief systems.
Right.
We are not taking any sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of this content, nor are we drawing parallels to any modern political figures or movements. We are impartially reporting on the historical text and examining the scientific methodology used by researchers in 1950.
That is the correct framing. The research conducted by Adorno, Els Frenkel Brunswick, Daniel Levinson, and R. Nevitt Sanford was born out of a profound existential crisis. The world had just witnessed the mechanized horrors of the Holocaust and the devastating efficiency of fascist regimes.
They were just trying to understand how it happened.
Psychologists were desperate to understand the psychological bedrock that allowed millions of citizens to embrace such destructive anti-democratic ideologies. They hypothesized that the vulnerability to fascism wasn't just a matter of external political persuasion, but was rooted in a specific, deep-seated personality structure formed during early childhood.
So to quantify this, they surveyed over 2,000 individuals using a highly extensive questionnaire they developed, known as the F scale. The F literally stood for fascism. They were hunting for a specific cluster of traits that would define the authoritarian personality type.
Based on their analysis of the F-scale data and subsequent clinical interviews, they profiled the authoritarian personality as possessing several interlocking characteristics.
Like what?
These included a rigid adherence to conventional middle-class values, an uncritical, almost submissive attitude toward idealized moral authorities of the in-group, a tendency to project one's own unconscious, repressed emotional impulses outward onto others, and a profound intolerance of ambiguity.
So no gray areas.
Exactly. For the authoritarian mind, the world is strictly binary, black and white, strong and weak, good and evil. Crucially, they found a strong statistical correlation. Individuals who scored highly on the F scale also demonstrated high levels of generalized prejudice against minority outgroups and a strong inclination toward ethnocentrism.
It was a massive, ambitious theory. They were basically trying to diagnose the pathology of an entire society through individual personality tests. But as we see constantly in the history of psychology, pioneers often leave massive methodological holes in their wake.
Oh, this one had some major holes.
The F scale faced a barrage of scientific criticism, most notably from Herbert Hyman and Paul Sheetsley in 1954 regarding a massive flaw called acquiescence bias.
Yes, the structural design of the F scale survey was fundamentally compromised. Almost every single statement on the questionnaire was phrased in a positive direction. This meant that a response of agree always indicated a higher level of authoritarianism.
Oh, I see the problem there.
Therefore, if a participant was simply a highly agreeable person, or if they had a tendency to defer to the authority of the test administrator by just circling yes straight down the page, they would generate a massive authoritarian score.
Wow.
The test was essentially incapable of distinguishing between actual fascist ideology and simple mindless compliance.
It's like taking a magazine personality quiz where answering C to everything tells you that you're a sociopath. The tool itself is just broken.
Furthermore, sociological critics argued that Adorno committed a fundamental attribution error on a massive scale. By trying to locate the origins of fascism entirely within the neuroses of individual personalities, he minimized the immense complex macroeconomic and historical forces like the Treaty of Versailles or the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic that actually create the conditions for authoritarianism to thrive.
So given these fatal flaws, did the scientific community just abandon the concept entirely?
Not at all. The execution was flawed, but the core inquiry was deemed too important to abandon. The theory evolved through decades of rigorous refinement. In 1981, Bob Altemeyer addressed the methodological disasters of the F scale and developed the right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA, scale.
How did he fix it?
He utilized balanced psychometric scaling to eliminate acquiescence bias and narrowed the construct to focus strictly on submission to established authorities, aggressive enforcement of norms, and high conventionality.
Okay, that makes sense.
Later in 1999, Jim Sidanius and Felicia Prado expanded the lens with social dominance orientation, or SDO theory. SDO shifted the focus away from individual pathology and examined prejudice as a structural, group-level desire to maintain social hierarchies and dominate outgroups. So Adorno's flawed initial steps eventually paved the way for highly sophisticated modern frameworks.
Which is the beauty of the scientific method. It stumbles, but it corrects itself. This brings us into the late 1950s. We spent a lot of time talking about how the external environment, the group, the leader, forces us to conform. But now we have to look inward. What happens when a person's own actions violently contradict their own internal beliefs?
Right. How do we live with ourselves?
Exactly. How does the human brain cope with the friction of hypocrisy?
This is the domain of Leon Festinger, who introduced the theory of cognitive dissonance in 1957. Festinger proposed a deeply elegant mechanic of the human mind. We have this intrinsic psychological drive to maintain harmony between our cognitions, our beliefs, our values, our attitudes, and our overt behaviors.
We want to make sense to ourselves.
Exactly. When a discrepancy occurs, when we do something that violates our beliefs, it generates a state of profound psychological tension. This is cognitive dissonance. It literally feels uncomfortable. And because we cannot tolerate that discomfort, we are driven to resolve it. We often employ highly irrational, almost delusional mental gymnastics to restore equilibrium.
And to demonstrate this empirically, Festinger and J. Merrill Carlsmith designed what has to be the most deliberately agonizing experiment in the history of psychology.
Oh, it was awful.
They brought college students into a laboratory and instructed them to perform a task. The task consisted of sitting at a table with a wooden board covered in wooden pegs. For 30 minutes, the student had to use one hand to turn every single peg a quarter turn to the right.
Just brutal.
Then, for the next 30 minutes, they had to take spools of thread off a tray and put them back on over and over again. It was designed to be the absolute zenith of mind-numbing, soul-crushing boredom.
And every single participant universally agreed that it was excruciatingly dull. But the true experiment didn't begin until the peg turning was over.
Right. As the exhausted participant is getting ready to leave, the researcher puts on an act. He looks flustered and says, "Listen, we have a problem. The next participant is waiting outside in the hallway. Usually I have a student assistant go out there and brief them, tell them the experiment is really fun and exciting, just to set their expectations. But my assistant called in sick. Could you do me a huge favor? Could you go out there and lie to the next person? Just tell them the peg turning was a blast.
The researcher is explicitly asking the participant to engage in a behavior, lying to a stranger, that fundamentally contradicts their cognition that the task was agonizingly boring.
And they offered money, right?
To incentivize this, the researchers introduced the critical variable, money. Half of the participants were offered $20 to tell the lie. The other half were offered only $1. We must remember this was 1959. $20 was a very substantial sum for a college student, whereas $1 was pocket change.
So both groups accept the money. Both groups go out to the waiting room, look the Confederate in the eye, and lie. Oh yeah, the peg board was incredibly engaging. You're going to love it.
The lie is delivered.
After they lie, the participant is taken to a completely separate office where an interviewer asks them to confidentially rate how much they actually enjoyed the peg turning task. Now, basic economic logic dictates that the group who received $20 might rate the task higher, right? They got a big reward. They associate the room with money. They should be happy.
Logical, but wrong.
Human psychology completely inverted the logic. The group paid $20, rated the task as incredibly boring, accurately reflecting reality. The group paid $1. They rated the task as significantly more enjoyable, interesting, and scientifically important.
This finding is the absolute cornerstone of cognitive dissonance theory. Let's trace the psychological mechanism step by step. The participants in the $20 group hold two conflicting cognitions. The task was awful, and I just told a stranger it was great. However, they have a massive, undeniable external justification for their behavior. The $20.
So they don't feel bad.
Their brain easily resolves the friction. They think, I am a truthful person, but I lied because I was heavily compensated. I am a rational economic actor. No dissonance is generated.
But the $1 group is trapped.
Exactly. They hold the same conflicting cognitions, but their external justification is a measly single dollar. A dollar is not enough money to justify compromising your integrity. So the brain is caught in a crisis. I'm a good, honest person is colliding with, I just lied to someone for almost no reason.
Ouch.
The psychological discomfort is acute. Now, the participant cannot change the behavior. The lie has already been spoken. So to alleviate the agonizing dissonance, the unconscious mind takes the only remaining route. It alters the internal attitude.
It changes reality.
Yes. The participant convinces themselves, you know what? I didn't actually lie. Turning those pegs had a certain meditative rhythm. It was actually quite interesting. They completely rewrite their own memory of the experience to protect their self-concept as an honest person.
I use this analogy all the time to explain modern consumerism. It is exactly like buying an incredibly expensive, overhyped piece of technology. Let's say you drop $1,000 on a new virtual reality headset.
Okay.
You take it home, put it on, and it's terrible. The graphics are blurry. It gives you a migraine. There are no good games. It's a piece of junk. But the dissonance between I am a smart, savvy consumer and I just wasted $1,000 on garbage is too painful for the ego to bear.
So what do?
You don't return it. You convince yourself it's a misunderstood masterpiece. You tell all your friends it's the future of entertainment just so you don't have to face the humiliation of being wrong.
That is a flawless modern application of the theory. The more effort, money, or pain we invest in something, the more desperately we will rationalize its value. However, the scientific narrative didn't end with Festinger. 10 years later, in 1967, Darrell Bem introduced a compelling rival theory called self-perception theory.
Oh, right, Bem.
Bem argued that Festinger is overcomplicating things by assuming a state of internal, painful dissonance. Bem proposed a simpler mechanism. We don't always know our own attitudes. When we are unsure of how we feel, we act like external observers of our own behavior. We look at what we did, and we infer our attitude from it.
So I look at myself like I'm watching movies my life.
Precisely. According to Bem, the $1 participant looks back and thinks, well, I just told someone the task was fun, and I certainly wouldn't lie for just $1. Therefore, logically, I must have actually enjoyed the task. There is no painful tension, just cool logical deduction based on observing one's own actions.
So who was right, Festinger or Bem?
For years, psychologists fiercely debated Festinger versus Bem. Ultimately, modern consensus suggests that both theories are correct, but they operate under different conditions. Cognitive dissonance triggers when a core element of our identity or self-esteem is directly threatened by our behavior. Self-perception theory takes over in situations where our initial attitudes are weak, ambiguous, or unimportant.
It is deeply unsettling to realize how easily our brains will deceive us just to keep us comfortable. But as we transition into the 1960s, that internal deception takes on a much darker, much more dangerous character.
It really does.
Because if cognitive dissonance explains how we justify minor hypocrisies, the 1960s brought experiments that reveal how ordinary people can be coaxed into committing and justifying absolute atrocities. We must examine the work of Stanley Milgram.
Milgram's experiments on obedience to authority, conducted at Yale University between 1961 and 1963, remain the most famous, controversial, and deeply disturbing body of research in the history of psychology.
To truly understand why Milgram did this, you have to immerse yourself in the historical atmosphere of 1961. The world was watching the televised trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary logistical architects of the Holocaust, in Jerusalem.
The whole world was watching.
The philosopher Hannah Arendt was covering the trial and coined the phrase, the banality of evil. The terrifying realization was that Eichmann didn't appear to be a foaming at the mouth psychopath. He appeared to be a boring, meticulous bureaucrat who simply followed orders and focused on the efficiency of the train schedules, ignoring the fact that the trains were going to death camps.
Milgram wanted to test this Eichmann hypothesis. Was there something uniquely flawed in the German character? Or could any ordinary person, say, an American plumber or schoolteacher, be ordered to inflict lethal pain on an innocent stranger?
Let me paint the picture of the methodology, because every detail was designed to maximize psychological pressure. You answer a newspaper ad offering $4 for a study on memory and learning at Yale. You arrive and meet another participant, a genial, slightly overweight, middle-aged man. You draw slips of paper to assign roles. You get teacher, and the other man gets learner.
And you watch as the learner is taken into a small room.
Right, strapped into a chair and has electrodes pasted to his arms with a conductive gel to, quote-unquote, prevent blistering. You are then taken into an adjacent control room and seated in front of a massive, imposing shock generator.
The visual design of that shock box is crucial. It featured a horizontal row of 30 switches, starting at 15 volts and increasing in 15-volt increments all the way to 450 volts. Milgram meticulously labeled the switches with ominous text. It started with slight shock, moved up to danger, severe shock, and the final switches were simply labeled with a red XXX.
And they gave you a sample shock, right?
To ensure the teacher believed the machine was real, the experimenter gave them a sample 45-volt shock, which genuinely stings.
So standing right behind your shoulder in the control room is the experimenter, a stern, impassive man wearing a gray technician's coat holding a clipboard. He is the physical embodiment of scientific authority. Your task is to read a list of word pairs into a microphone. The learner in the other room has to indicate the correct match by pressing a button. If he gets it wrong, you are instructed to press a switch and deliver a shock. And crucially, with every single incorrect answer, you must move one switch to the right. The voltage must continuously increase.
That continuous escalation is key.
At 75 volts, you hear the learner grunt through the wall. At 150 volts, he yells out, complaining about his heart and demands to be released. At 300 volts, he is screaming in pure agony and pounding his fists against the wall. At 330 volts, the screaming stops. There is only dead silence. He stops pressing the buttons.
The worst case scenario.
And the experimenter standing behind you looks at his clipboard and says in a flat voice, "Treat the absence of a response as a wrong answer. Please continue."
The psychological trauma inflicted on the participants in that chair was immense. They were trembling, sweating profusely, digging their fingernails into their own flesh, stuttering. Many pleaded with the experimenter to let them stop, offering to give the $4 back.
And how did the experimenter respond?
When they hesitated, the experimenter deployed a standardized sequence of 4 verbal prods. First, please continue. Second, the experiment requires that you continue. Third, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And fourth, you have no other choice, you must go on.
Before running the study, Milgram polled psychology majors, middle-class adults, and a panel of professional psychiatrists. He asked them to predict what percentage of participants would pull every single switch and administer the maximum 450-volt shock.
The experts weighed in.
The psychiatrists confidently predicted that only 1 in 1,000, the true clinical sociopaths, would go all the way. The actual reality, 65%. Nearly 2/3 of completely normal, everyday Americans administered what they fully believed were lethal electrical shocks to a silent, potentially dead man in the next room, simply because a man in a lab coat politely but firmly told them they had no choice.
The results shattered the prevailing Western assumption of individual moral autonomy. To explain this terrifying phenomenon, Milgram developed agency theory. He theorized that human beings possess two states of social operation. The first is the autonomous state, where we direct our own actions and accept full moral responsibility for the consequences.
You're in the second state.
However, when we enter a hierarchical system and are confronted by a recognized legitimate authority figure, we undergo a profound psychological shift into the agentic state. In this state, we cease to view ourselves as the authors of our actions. Instead, we view ourselves merely as instruments agents executing the wishes of the authority. The moral burden is transferred entirely.
Because they just wash their hands of it.
The participants in Milgram's lab managed the immense dissonance by telling themselves, I am just doing my job. The Yale scientist is the one who is responsible if this man dies. This concept was later expanded upon by Philip Zimbardo, who coined the Lucifer effect, to describe how systemic structures, uniforms, and rigid hierarchies can systematically disable individual moral compasses.
But the fallout from this experiment wasn't just about the findings, it was about the horrific cost of acquiring them.
Absolutely. The publication of Milgram's results triggered one of the most intense ethical firestorms in the history of science, spearheaded by psychologist Diana Baumrind in 1964. Baumrind launched a devastating critique of Milgram's methodology, focusing squarely on the profound psychological abuse inflicted upon the naive participants.
She was really angry, wasn't she?
Very. She argued that tricking people into believing they had brutally tortured or murdered another human being was an unconscionable violation of trust. She pointed out that the extreme stress, the trembling, and the visible anguish of the participants proved that the experiment was inflicting real trauma. Baumrind argued forcefully that no scientific insight, no matter how profound, justifies using human beings as collateral damage in a psychological game.
Milgram fought back, of course. He pointed to his extensive debriefing process. After the experiment, he immediately introduced the traumatized participant to the unharmed actor to show them everything was fake. He also sent out follow-up questionnaires a year later, which showed that 84% of the participants were actually glad to have been in the experiment, and many felt they had learned a vital, humbling lesson about their own vulnerability to authority.
True, but Baumrind's critique ultimately won the historical war. The intense scrutiny of Milgram's methods, along with other ethically dubious studies of the era, led directly to a complete overhaul of research ethics. It resulted in the establishment of institutional review boards, or IRBs, across universities.
So you can't just do whatever you want anymore.
No. They implemented strict, non-negotiable guidelines regarding informed consent, the right to withdraw at any time without pressure, and the mandate to protect participants from psychological harm. Milgram's experiment is the reason you can never run Milgram's experiment today.
Although, there is a fascinating footnote to that. In 2009, a researcher named Jerry Berger actually managed to replicate the Milgram study, and he did it legally under the approval of a modern IRB. The workaround he used is incredibly clever.
Berger performed a deep dive into Milgram's original data and identified a critical statistical threshold, the 150-volt mark. This is the exact moment in the script where the learner first demands to be released, complaining about his heart.
So why is that mark so important?
Berger noticed that in the original data, if a participant pushed the button at 150 volts and ignored that first plea for help, they almost inevitably went all the way to 450. The 150-volt switch was the psychological point of no return. So Berger designed a modified replication. He recreated the exact setup, but the moment the participant agreed to press the 151-volt switch, the experimenter immediately stopped the session.
Oh, so nobody got tortured all the way to the end.
Right, they didn't subject the participant to the drawn-out agony of the higher voltages, but they captured the critical data point of obedience.
And the result in 2009. Even with a modern audience aware of reality TV and psychological tricks, 70% of the participants were willing to continue past that 150-volt point of no return. Almost half a century later, the fundamental mechanism of human obedience had not changed one bit.
Sobering.
If Milgram demonstrated how easily authority can force us into horrific action, the next major study of the 1960s demonstrated how easily the mere presence of a crowd can force us into tragic inaction. We have to discuss John Darley, Bib Latané, and the bystander effect.
This research was born out of a very specific, heavily publicized tragedy. The murder of Kitty Genovese in Queens, New York in 1964. The narrative pushed by the media at the time, specifically a highly sensationalized article in the New York Times, was that Genovese was attacked outside her apartment building, and for over half an hour, 38 neighbors listened to her scream, watched the attack from their windows, and not a single person picked up the phone to call the police.
It's just a horrifying story.
Now, historical record has since proven that the 38 witnesses narrative was wildly exaggerated by the press. Some people did call, and the timeline was distorted. But the cultural impact of the story was seismic. The media framed it as proof of the ultimate decay of urban morality, a symptom of a cold, alienated, sociopathic society.
But Darley and Latané, looking at it through the lens of social psychology, hypothesized something entirely different. They didn't think it was a loss of morality. They suspected it was a mathematical problem of psychology. They hypothesized that the sheer number of people present actually paralyzed the response.
And to test this, they designed the intercom seizure experiment in 1968. They brought college students into a laboratory and placed them in isolated, enclosed cubicles. The researcher explained that to ensure complete anonymity and encourage an open conversation about the personal pressures of college life, the participants would communicate solely through an intercom system, taking turns speaking for 2 minutes each. The researcher explicitly stated he would not be listening in.
In reality, the participant was the only real person in the study. All the other voices on the intercom were pre-recorded tapes.
Exactly.
The experiment begins normally with voices sharing struggles. Then, one of the voices mentions he is prone to severe stress-induced seizures. When it is his turn to speak again, the voice begins to severely stutter, breathes heavily, and suddenly launches into a full-blown audible seizure. He is choking, crying out for help, saying he is going to die, before the intercom cuts to dead silence.
The dependent variable was simply whether the participant would leave their cubicle and alert the researcher to the emergency. The independent variable, the crucial factor being manipulated, was how many other people the participant believed were listening on the intercom network.
And the findings are just as bleak as Milgram's. When participants believed they were the only person on the line with the victim, they reacted immediately. 85% of them leaped out of their chairs, left the cubicle, and sought help before the seizure audio even finished.
They stepped up when they had to.
But when participants believed they were part of a 6-person network, meaning they thought 4 other students were also listening to the victim, the intervention rate plummeted. Only 31% made any attempt to help. The majority sat frozen in their cubicles, sweating and anxious, but entirely paralyzed.
This is the bystander effect. And Darley and Latané identified 2 powerful psychological mechanisms driving it. The first is pluralistic ignorance. Emergencies are often ambiguous. When we hear a loud crash or see someone slumped on a bench, our immediate reaction is to look at the people around us to interpret the event. If everyone else is standing around calmly, looking at each other, we unconsciously conclude that it must not be an emergency. The group inadvertently hypnotizes itself into inaction.
So nobody acts because nobody else is acting.
Right. The second and more powerful mechanism is the diffusion of responsibility. This is the exact same mathematical principle we discussed with Ringelmann's rope pulling, but applied to human morality. If you are entirely alone and witness a tragedy, 100% of the moral burden rests squarely on your shoulders. If you do nothing, you carry 100% of the guilt. But if you are in a crowd of 10 people, your psychological burden drops to 10%. You rationalize someone else is probably closer, someone else probably already called the police, someone else here is probably a doctor.
This is exactly why modern first aid and CPR classes teach a very specific protocol. If someone collapses, you do not yell out to the crowd, "Somebody help, call 911. That just diffuses the responsibility over the whole crowd, and everyone will assume someone else is doing it.
Exactly right.
You are taught to point directly at one specific individual and say, "You in the red shirt, call 911. You have to weaponize psychology to save a life. You have to isolate the moral burden onto a single person to shatter the diffusion."
Precisely. Darley and Latané codified this entire process into a 5-step decision model that remains the backbone of emergency intervention theory. For a person to help, they must successfully navigate 5 cognitive hurdles.
What are the steps?
First, they must notice the event amidst distractions. Second, they must actively interpret the event as an emergency, overcoming pluralistic ignorance. Third, they must assume personal responsibility, overcoming the diffusion of responsibility. Fourth, they must possess the knowledge or competence to help. And fifth, they must make the final decision to implement the help, weighing the personal costs and risks. Failure at any single step results in a bystander remaining a bystander.
Moving forward into the late 1960s and the 1970s, the field begins to shift its focus. Milgram and Latané examined extreme, acute, terrifying moments. But researchers in this new era started looking at the slow burn. How do long-term roles, subtle expectations, and arbitrary group assignments slowly warp our identity and our reality? Let's begin with the concept of expectations and the work of Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson in 1968 regarding the Pygmalion effect.
This is an incredibly elegant, if somewhat controversial, demonstration of how external beliefs can literally sculpt internal ability. Rosenthal and Jacobson entered a California elementary school and administered a standard nonverbal intelligence test to all the students. However, they kept the real results hidden.
Instead, they approached the teachers and handed them a fake list of students. They told the teachers, based on our advanced psychological metrics, the children on this specific list are poised for a massive intellectual bloom this academic year. They are late bloomers, and their cognitive abilities are about to skyrocket. In reality, the names on that list were pulled entirely at random from a hat. They were perfectly average, randomly selected children.
The researchers left the school, let a full academic year pass, and then returned to administer the intelligence test a second time. Astoundingly, the randomly selected children who had been labeled as bloomers actually exhibited significantly higher gains in their IQ scores compared to the control group of their peers.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the teachers firmly believed these kids were exceptionally gifted, they treated them as if they were exceptionally gifted, which actually caused them to become exceptionally gifted. But I have to push back here because this sounds a little bit like the law of attraction or magic. If I just believe really hard that my dog is a genius, is he going to learn to do my taxes? How far does this actual mechanism go?
Your dog's financial career is unlikely to take off, and your skepticism is echoed by decades of educational psychologists. The Pygmalion effect has been subjected to intense critical scrutiny. Most notably, Elashoff and Snow in 1971 completely reanalyzed Rosenthal's data and found significant flaws. They demonstrated that the effect was heavily exaggerated in the original reporting and that it almost exclusively applied to very young children in the first and second grades.
So it didn't work on older kids.
Older children, whose academic identities and peer reputations were already solidified, did not experience magical IQ spikes just because a teacher expected them to. However, subsequent highly rigorous meta-analyses, such as the one conducted by Rodenbush in 1984, have confirmed that the Pygmalion effect is real, albeit modest. And it is not magic. It is entirely behavioral.
So what are the teachers actually doing differently?
When a teacher holds high expectations for a student, they subtly alter their micro-behaviors. They tend to create a warmer emotional climate for that student, offering more smiles and eye contact. They give that student more complex material to study. When the student struggles with a question, the teacher gives them more time to answer and guides them toward the solution, rather than quickly moving on to someone else. Over the course of thousands of interactions across a school year, these subtle behavioral advantages compound, resulting in genuine academic growth.
It shows how deeply our potential is tethered to the social environment that nurtures us. Now, we cannot talk about the 1970s and the power of assumed roles without discussing the absolute titan of pop psychology, Philip Zimbardo's 1971 Stanford prison experiment.
Of course.
If you have ever taken a psychology class or honestly just watched a documentary in the last 40 years, you know the basic setup. Zimbardo converts the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building into a mock prison. He screens collegemen to ensure they are perfectly healthy, normal, and nonviolent. He flips a coin to divide them. Half become guards, half become prisoners.
The roles are set.
The guards get khaki uniforms, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses to remove eye contact. The prisoners are arrested by real police, stripped, deloused, and forced to wear humiliating smocks with ID numbers, completely erasing their names. The experiment is scheduled to last 2 weeks.
But it didn't?
No. Within days, the guards begin exhibiting shocking levels of sadism. They strip the prisoners naked, force them to sleep on concrete, put them in solitary confinement, and subject them to psychological torture. The prisoners break down, exhibiting severe depression, uncontrollable crying, and psychosomatic rashes. Zimbardo is forced to shut the entire experiment down after just 6 days.
Which shocked everyone.
For half a century, the universally accepted takeaway has been, human morality is incredibly fragile. Put a good apple in a bad barrel and the barrel will rot the apple. The sheer power of the guard role automatically overrides individual conscience and turns people evil.
That has been the dominant narrative. It is printed in virtually every introductory psychology textbook. But this is where the modern chronology of science becomes incredibly thrilling, because recent archival research has completely dismantled this narrative, revealing a reality that is far more complex and arguably much less sensational.
Okay, what'd they find?
In 2019, a researcher named Thibault Letexier gained access to Zimbardo's original archives at Stanford. He listened to the unreleased audio recordings of the experiment and read the daily notes. He discovered that the guards did not simply put on a uniform and organically devolve into sadistic tyrants. They were actively, heavily coached by the researchers on how to be cruel.
This changes everything. What kind of coaching are we talking about?
The audio tapes reveal Zimbardo and his lead researcher, acting as the warden, holding orientation meetings with the guards. They explicitly instructed the guards to create an atmosphere of fear, to induce a sense of helplessness, and to ensure the prisoners felt they had absolutely no power. When some guards tried to be lenient or friendly, the researchers pulled them aside and reprimanded them, telling them they had to act tough for the good of the experiment.
So it wasn't a natural consequence of assuming a role at all. It was literally Milgram's obedience to authority. The guards were just following the explicit demands of the men in lab coats who were running the study.
Precisely. It fundamentally undermines the bad barrel hypothesis. This archival revelation is further supported by the 2006 BBC prison study conducted by Alex Haslam and Stephen Riker. They attempted to replicate the dynamics of the Stanford experiment, but with rigorous ethical oversight and zero active coaching from the researchers. They simply put the guards and prisoners in the environment and watched what happened organically.
And what happened?
Their findings were the exact opposite of Zimbardo's. The guards did not automatically become tyrannical. In fact, they felt deeply uncomfortable with their unearned authority and struggled to maintain order. The prisoners, meanwhile, quickly realized their shared disadvantage, developed a strong group identity, organized, and ultimately overthrew the guards' authority, causing the prison system to collapse.
So if the role doesn't automatically turn you evil, what does?
Riker and Haslam argue from the perspective of social identity theory. They propose that people do not blindly conform to roles. Instead, people only enact a role enthusiastically if they internalize that specific identity and believe their actions are advancing a shared, noble group goal.
That makes a lot of sense.
In the Stanford experiment, Zimbardo successfully convinced the guards that they were essential partners in a vital scientific endeavor to understand prison reform. He gave them a noble ideological justification for their cruelty. The guards were not acting out of innate sadism triggered by uniform. They were engaging in engaged followership. They believed their brutality was necessary for the success of the science.
It is a profound reframing. It doesn't absolve the guards of their cruelty, but it completely changes the psychological mechanism of why they committed it. And bringing up social identity theory perfectly transitions us to the man who laid its foundation, Henri Tajfel.
Tajfel's work is brilliant.
In 1971, Tajfel developed the minimal group paradigm. If Zimbardo was looking at how intense immersive roles affect us, Tajfel wanted to strip everything away. He wanted to find the absolute minimum requirement necessary to make human beings form tribes and discriminate against each other.
Tajfel's experimental design is a masterpiece of reductionism. He took groups of British schoolboys and showed them slides of abstract paintings by two artists, Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky. He asked the boys which artists they preferred. Based on their answers, he divided them into two groups. In some variations of this study, he didn't even use paintings. He literally just flipped a coin to assign them to Group A or Group B.
So totally arbitrary.
Entirely.
Yeah.
These groups had no history. They had no ideological differences. They were not competing for scarce resources. They didn't even interact with each other during the experiment. It was the most arbitrary, minimal group identity imaginable.
Once they were divided, Tajfel put them in isolation and asked them to distribute points, which translated to real money, to anonymous members of their own group and anonymous members of the other group. Now, pure economic rationality suggests they should just try to maximize the absolute amount of money everyone walks away with, or at the very least, just be fair and distribute it equally. But human tribalism overrode all logic. The boys instantly and consistently discriminated in favor of their arbitrary in-group.
Yes. But the detail that truly haunts sociologists, the finding that explains so much of human conflict, is how they chose to distribute the money. They were given matrices of choices, and they consistently chose options that actually lower their own group's absolute payout, strictly to maximize the relative difference between them and the outgroup.
That is wild. Can you give an example of that?
To illustrate, they would rather choose an option where their group gets $7 and the outgroup gets $1 than an option where their group gets $10 and the outgroup gets $9. They willingly sacrificed objective wealth to ensure subjective superiority.
They literally paid a tax just to watch the other guy lose.
Exactly. This behavior forms the bedrock of Tajfel and John Turner's social identity theory. The theory posits that a significant portion of our self-esteem is derived not from our individual achievements, but from the social groups to which we belong. Therefore, we possess a deep psychological need to view our in-group positively.
And the easiest way to do that?
The fastest way to artificially inflate the value of our in-group is to actively devalue and discriminate against the out-group. This mechanism scales flawlessly from boys arguing over abstract art to massive geopolitical conflicts fueled by nationalism.
Rounding out this era of intense behavioral study, we must look at how we learn these behaviors in the first place. This brings us to Albert Bandura and his Bobo doll experiments conducted between 1961 and 1963. Bandura shifted the focus away from internal drives and looked at observation.
What did he do?
He brought preschool children into a playroom. In one condition, the child sat in the corner while an adult model quietly played with Tinker Toys. In the experimental condition, the child watched as the adult model suddenly turned to a large, inflatable Bobo doll, one of those weighted punching bags with a clown face, and unleashed a torrent of specific physical aggression.
Very specific aggression.
The adult punched it in the nose, hit it with a wooden mallet, kicked it across the room, and yelled specific aggressive phrases. After witnessing this, the child was taken to a different room filled with highly attractive toys, but they were told they weren't allowed to play with them, which intentionally induced a state of mild frustration. Then they were finally placed in a room containing the Bobo doll.
The results were definitive. The children who had observed the aggressive adult not only attacked the Bobo doll, but they perfectly mimicked the specific, novel acts of aggression they had witnessed. They picked up the mallet, they used the exact same aggressive language. Furthermore, they creatively extrapolated on the violence, finding new ways to attack the doll. The control group, who observed the peaceful adult, exhibited almost zero aggression toward the doll.
Which birthed social learning theory, right?
Yes, it did. It posits that human behavior is deeply reliant on observational modeling. We do not need to be directly rewarded or punished to learn a behavior. We simply need to watch someone else do it.
It seems like undeniable proof that exposing kids to violence makes them violent. But, as always, we must look at the critiques.
The primary critique leveled against Bandura's methodology is evaluation apprehension, or demand characteristics. Critics argue that a Bobo doll is literally designed to be punched. It's a novelty punching bag.
Right.
When a child watches an adult punch a punching bag and is then placed in a room with that same punching bag, they aren't necessarily learning an internalized trait of aggression. They might simply be deducing, the adult showed me how this specific toy is supposed to be played with. The researcher expects me to hit it, so I will hit it.
That makes perfect sense.
Despite this valid critique regarding the artificiality of the setting, Bandura's core concept ignited decades of vital ongoing research into how media violence, video games, and domestic observation shape childhood development.
Which provides a perfect bridge as we leave the 1970s. For the first hour of this journey, we have been hyper-focused on overt visible behaviors. People pulling ropes, shocking strangers, yelling into intercoms, hitting dolls. But as we enter Section 6, covering the 1980s through the 2000s, the field of social psychology undergoes a profound cognitive revolution.
The focus shifts inward.
Researchers stop looking at what the hands are doing and start looking at the invisible internal processing errors of the mind that dictate our choices, our biases, and our societal inequalities. The undisputed heavyweights of this cognitive era are Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their 1979 publication of prospect theory didn't just change psychology, it fundamentally broke and rebuilt the entire discipline of economics.
Classical economics was built on a foundational assumption. Homo economicus. The idea that human beings are perfectly rational actors who flawlessly calculate probabilities to maximize their utility. Kahneman and Tversky proved, through a series of ingenious cognitive puzzles, that humans are spectacularly irrational.
And the core pillar of prospect theory is loss aversion.
The concept of loss aversion. Through their experiments, they mathematically proved that the psychological pain of losing something is approximately twice as powerful as the psychological pleasure of gaining the exact same thing.
Right. If I am walking down the street and I find a $20 bill on the sidewalk, I feel a quick burst of joy. It's a good moment. But if I reach into my pocket and realize I have lost a $20 bill, it ruins my entire afternoon. I ruminate on it. The objective monetary value is identical, but the emotional gravity of the loss is vastly heavier.
And because our brains are wired with this intense fear of loss, our decisions can be completely manipulated by the framing of a choice, even when the underlying statistics remain exactly the same.
Can you give a real-world example?
To use a classic medical example, imagine you must undergo a serious surgery. If the surgeon tells you, this procedure has a 90% survival rate, your brain focuses on the gain, it feels safe, and you consent to the surgery. However, if the surgeon presents the exact same statistical reality and says this procedure has a 10% mortality rate, your brain immediately triggers its loss aversion circuitry.
Because it's focused on the 10%.
You focus on the death, the risk feels completely unacceptable, and you are far more likely to refuse the surgery. The reality hasn't changed, only the linguistic frame has changed.
And this realization birthed the entirely new field of behavioral economics. It led directly to Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein's nudge theory, which is the architecture of modern public policy. Governments and corporations now design the framing of choices like making organ donation an opt-out system rather than an opt-in system to gently nudge irrational human brains toward better societal outcomes without restricting their freedom of choice.
It is incredible how a slight linguistic shift can bypass our logic. And that understanding of cognitive vulnerability leads directly into one of the most vital and heartbreaking studies on societal inequality. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 research on stereotype threat.
They wanted to understand why persistent achievement gaps existed between demographic groups and educational settings. They brought Black and white college students, all with similar academic backgrounds, into a laboratory and gave them a highly difficult standardized test composed of questions from the GRE.
The brilliance of the study lies entirely in the framing. They divided the students into two conditions. In the first condition, they introduced the test to the students as a diagnostic intellectual capacity assessment. They framed it as a genuine measure of their innate intelligence.
And the second group?
In the second condition, they gave the students the exact same test, but framed it as a problem-solving tool. They explicitly told the students that it was merely a laboratory exercise to understand psychological mechanics, and that it was completely unrelated to their personal intelligence.
The results are devastating. In the first condition, where the test was framed as a measure of intelligence, the Black students significantly underperformed compared to their white peers. But why?
Because that specific framing activated a pervasive, negative societal stereotype regarding race and intelligence. As the Black students sat down to take the test, they were not just wrestling with the math problems, they were wrestling with the psychological weight of the stereotype.
The pressure must have been immense.
They experienced an acute fear that if they performed poorly, they would confirm a terrible prejudice about their group. This anxiety, this stereotype threat, consumed their working memory, spiked their cognitive load, and actively impaired their ability to focus on the test.
But the true revelation is found in the second condition. When the exact same test was framed merely as a problem-solving exercise, effectively lifting the stereotype threat, the massive performance gap between the Black and white students virtually disappeared. Their scores were nearly identical.
It proves that the performance gap is not a matter of innate biological ability. It is a matter of the psychological environment we force people to operate within. It is Lewin's equation echoing through time again. Behavior is a function of the person and the environment. If you poison the cognitive environment with prejudice, you crush the potential of the person.
Moving from the societal to the deeply intimate, the 1980s also saw researchers map our cognitive frameworks onto our romantic lives. Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver published a groundbreaking paper in 1987 that brought attachment theory into adulthood.
They built upon the pioneering work of Mary Ainsworth, who observed how infants attach to their primary caregivers, categorizing them into secure, anxious, ambivalent, and avoidant attachment styles. Hazan and Shaver boldly proposed that the emotional blueprint you construct with your parents in infancy does not disappear. It becomes the internal working model for how you navigate love, trust, and intimacy for the rest of your life.
What did they find about the different styles?
They demonstrated that securely attached adults find it easy to get close to others and don't fear abandonment. Avoidant adults are deeply uncomfortable with emotional closeness and prioritize independence to a fault. Anxious adults are desperate for merged intimacy, but are constantly terrified that their partner does not truly love them. This framework completely revolutionized relationship science, providing a cognitive map for our most irrational emotional bonds.
Which brings us to a fascinating juncture. Building on this immense foundation of cognitive biases, dissonance, and situational pressures, modern psychology has identified several highly specific syndromes and cognitive heuristics that govern our daily lives. Rather than just listing them, let's really dive into the mechanisms behind them, starting with the extreme psychology of captivity. Stockholm and Lima syndromes.
Stockholm syndrome represents arguably the most extreme, desperate manifestation of cognitive dissonance and the human survival instinct. It is observed in hostage situations where the victim is entirely dependent on the captor for their basic survival. The terror of the situation is absolute. However, the human mind cannot sustain a state of pure, unrelenting panic indefinitely. The system would collapse. To cope, the victim's unconscious mind begins to desperately search for a way to mitigate the threat. When the captor exhibits a tiny, trivial act of nonviolence, perhaps offering a glass of water or simply not killing them, the victim's terrified brain magnifies this into a profound act of mercy and kindness.
So they bond with the person terrorizing them.
They begin to emotionally identify with the captor, adopting their perspective, and even defending them, because aligning with the source of power is the only psychological strategy available to ensure survival. It is an illusion of connection forged in the fires of the absolute helplessness.
Lima syndrome is the inverse phenomenon, named after a 1996 hostage crisis at the Japanese embassy in Lima, Peru. In this scenario, the captors develop intense sympathy for their hostages. Why does that happen? You would think the captors have all the power, so they don't need to employ cognitive gymnastics.
It occurs because inflicting prolonged violence upon innocent people requires the captor to maintain a strict psychological devaluation of the victims. They have to constantly convince themselves the hostages are less than human. Over time, as they live in close quarters, the captors are forced to observe the hostages' humanity, their fear, their conversations, their shared routines.
So the empathy breaks through.
Exactly. The cognitive dissonance of "I am a righteous warrior" clashes with "I am torturing innocent people." If the captor's ideological conditioning isn't strong enough, empathy breaks through the devaluation, leading them to soften their stance and often release the hostages prematurely.
It is the mind desperately trying to assert humanity in fundamentally inhumane environments. But what happens when the human mind completely lacks that empathy? The research highlights the concept of the dark triad, often colloquially referred to in pop culture as the Hannibal Lecter profile.
The dark triad is a clinical constellation of three distinct yet overlapping malevolent personality traits. The first is narcissism, characterized by grandiosity, a desperate need for admiration, and a total lack of empathy. The second is Machiavellianism, named after the political philosopher, which involves a cynical, pragmatic disregard for morality and a laser focus on strategic deception and self-interest.
And the third?
The third is psychopathy, characterized by high impulsivity, thrill-seeking, and a chilling absence of remorse or guilt. When these three traits converge in a single individual, you have someone who is highly skilled at navigating the very social systems we've been discussing: conformity, obedience, identity. But they use that knowledge purely for exploitation. They utilize charm and emotional intelligence not to build authentic connections, but to manipulate the environment and extract utility from the people around them.
They are playing a completely different game than the rest of us. But let's pull back from the extremes of hostages and psychopaths. Let's look at the cognitive errors we all make every single day. I want to unpack the fundamental attribution error. I love this concept because I am profoundly guilty of it, specifically when I am driving.
Let's hear it.
If I am on the highway and a stranger violently cuts me off in traffic, my immediate automatic cognitive response is to attribute their behavior to their core innate personality. I think that person is a selfish monster. They are an aggressive, terrible human being. I ignore any potential context. But if I accidentally cut someone off, I do not conclude that I am a monster. I think, oh gosh, I am so sorry. I'm just running late for a critical meeting. The sun was blinding me and that lane merged out of nowhere. I attribute my own negative behavior entirely to the situational environment.
That asymmetry is the essence of the fundamental attribution error. We possess a deep cognitive bias that overemphasizes dispositional, personality-based explanations for the behavior of others, while simultaneously underemphasizing situational explanations. However, when evaluating our own behavior, we reverse the process. We afford ourselves the grace and nuance of situational context, but we ruthlessly deny that same context to strangers. It is a cognitive shortcut that smooths over our own flaws while magnifying the flaws of the world around us.
And that desire for a predictable, manageable world leads us to the final and perhaps most culturally damaging cognitive bias, the just world hypothesis.
Coined by Melvin Lerner in 1980, the just world hypothesis exposes our desperate, deep-seated psychological need to believe that the universe is fundamentally fair and morally balanced. We need to believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people.
Because the alternative is terrifying. If the world is truly random and unfair, it means a horrific tragedy, an illness, or a financial ruin could strike us or our families at any moment, regardless of how carefully we live our lives. The human brain cannot function under the constant weight of that existential terror.
Precisely. We require an illusion of safety. Therefore, when we are confronted with undeniable evidence of unfairness, when we see innocent victims of crime, systemic poverty, or random tragedy, our worldview is severely threatened. To resolve this dissonance and maintain the illusion that we are safe, our unconscious mind often engages in victim blaming.
We blame the person who got hurt.
Yes. We scrutinize the victim's behavior to find a reason for their suffering. We think, well, they shouldn't have been walking in that neighborhood at night, or they didn't work hard enough, or they should have seen the red flags. By inventing a flaw in the victim, we reassure ourselves that as long as we don't make that specific mistake, we will remain safe. It is a psychological defense mechanism that generates a profound societal lack of empathy.
We have spent an hour building this beautiful, terrifying, incredibly complex architecture of the human mind. We've laid out the mechanics of conformity, the horrors of obedience, the subtle power of roles, and the invisible biases that shape our reality. But as we enter our final era, the 2010s to the present day, a massive, unprecedented earthquake shakes the very foundation of everything we have just discussed.
The replication crisis.
What happens when a science dedicated to questioning human nature is suddenly forced to question itself? What if a significant portion of the facts we just spent an hour learning aren't actually facts? And the perfect entry point into this crisis is Amy Cuddy and the phenomenon of power poses in 2010.
Amy Cuddy's research was an absolute cultural leviathan. She published a paper and subsequently delivered a TED Talk, which became the second most watched in the platform's history, claiming that human beings could physically alter their neurochemistry through simple postural changes. She asserted that by standing like a superhero for just 2 minutes, hands on hips, legs planted wide, expanding your physical footprint, you could significantly increase your testosterone, which is the dominance hormone, and simultaneously lower your cortisol, the stress hormone.
It was presented as a biological life hack. Anyone, regardless of their status or anxiety, could just stand in a bathroom stall for 2 minutes before a job interview and biologically transform themselves into a confident leader. The corporate world devoured it.
But the scientific method is entirely immune to popularity. The bedrock of science is replication. If a finding is true, an independent laboratory should be able to follow the exact same methodology and achieve the exact same result. In 2015, Eva Rainhill and a team of researchers attempted a massive replication of Cuddy's study using a sample size of 200 participants, which was vastly larger than Cuddy's original sample.
And what did they find?
They found absolutely zero effect on testosterone or cortisol levels. The hormonal claims completely evaporated. Following this, in 2017, statisticians Yuri Simonson and Joe Simmons performed a forensic analysis of Cuddy's original data. They discovered it was riddled with methodological flaws and evidence of packing.
What is packing?
It's a controversial practice where researchers continuously massage, slice, and reanalyze their data until they cross the arbitrary statistical threshold required for publication, rendering the findings essentially meaningless. The backlash was so severe that Cuddy's own co-author, Dana Carney, published a statement entirely disavowing the original study, stating she no longer believed the effects was real.
And if it had just been Amy Cuddy, the field could have shrugged it off as one bad paper. But the dam was breaking everywhere. The broader crisis began to emerge, revealing a culture of systemic negligence and outright fraud. You had Dirk Stapel, a highly prominent social psychologist in Europe, who was caught completely fabricating the data for dozens of major papers over his career. He wasn't even running the experiments. He was just sitting at his kitchen table making up numbers in a spreadsheet.
It was devastating.
And then you had Daryl Bem, the very same researcher who challenged cognitive dissonance in the 60s, publishing a paper in the premier Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2011. Bem claimed to have found robust, statistically significant evidence for human precognition. He literally claimed to have proven that humans can predict the future.
Bem's paper was the catalyst for the crisis. The scientific community had a collective realization. If our accepted statistical methods and peer review processes are so loose that they can prove literal psychic powers are real, then our methods are fundamentally broken. This existential dread culminated in the Open Science collaboration in 2015. Hundreds of researchers banded together in an unprecedented effort to meticulously replicate 100 classic foundational studies published in top psychology journals.
The findings of that collaboration sent shockwaves through the academic world. Of the 100 classic studies tested, only 36 to 39% successfully replicated. The vast majority of the exciting counterintuitive findings that had filled textbooks and popular science blogs for a decade simply vanished when subjected to larger sample sizes and stricter controls. So I have to ask you, looking at this wreckage, does this mean social psychology is broken? Did we just spend an hour talking about fairy tales and statistical illusions?
No, absolutely not. I will argue vehemently that the replication crisis is not the death knell of social psychology. It is its greatest, most agonizing triumph. It is the very definition of science working exactly as it is supposed to. Science is not a collection of static facts. It is a mechanism for self-correction. The pain of the crisis forced a massive systemic overhaul of the entire discipline.
Like open science.
Exactly. It burst the open science movement. Today, rigorous researchers utilize pre-registration. Before they collect a single data point, they must publicly publish their exact hypotheses, their methodology, and their specific statistical analysis plan. This completely eliminates the ability to p-hack or change the goalposts after the fact. The field is moving away from the toxic publish or perish culture that incentivizes flashy, fragile results. We are utilizing vastly larger sample sizes, engaging in radical data transparency, and embracing replication as a vital scientific duty rather than a footnote.
So the foundations are still solid.
The foundational architecture we discussed today, the mechanisms of normative conformity, the terrifying reality of obedience to authority, the nuances of social identity, and the drive for cognitive consistency, those pillars have withstood the earthquake. They have been replicated and re-replicated. We haven't lost the house. We are simply renovating it with vastly sharper, more precise tools. The discipline is healthier, more rigorous, and more trustworthy today than it has been at any point in its history.
That is an incredibly reassuring perspective. It means we can trust the journey we've just been on. As we wrap up this massive exploration of human nature, I want you, the listener, to reflect on your own reality today. When you turn off this audio, look at the world through this new lens. Think about the clothes you chose to put on this morning. Was that an expression of your unique individual soul? Or was it the quiet, invisible hum of normative conformity?
A great question to ask.
Think about the way you performed at your job today. Were you energized by the social facilitation of your peers? Or did you slip into the comfortable anonymity of social loafing during that massive team project? Think about the biases you relied on during your commute, falling prey to the fundamental attribution error when you judged a stranger's entire character based on a single mistake in traffic. We are constantly swimming in these unseen social currents. Every choice, every attitude, every limitation is negotiated with the real or imagined presence of the crowd around us.
The motto of the Tourism Academy, recited at the very beginning of our discussion, is the priority is the courage to know the truth. If our thoughts, our biases, our moral limitations, and our very identities are so deeply permeable, so easily infected by the expectations, the leadership styles, and the structural system designed by others, we are left with a profound philosophical challenge. Where does society end, and where does your true autonomous self actually begin?
That's the real question.
The true courage demanded of us isn't merely seeking objective facts about the external world. The ultimate courage is turning that critical scientific lens inward. It is possessing the bravery to interrogate the very origin of your own thoughts. Are the beliefs you hold today genuinely yours? Or are they just echoes of the crowd bouncing around the dark room of your mind?
A lingering, vital question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive. We'll catch you next time.